Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. Today, as part of our series on controversial issues related to women, let's explore the topic of marriage in Islam. Is the relationship within a Muslim marriage similar to modern concepts of equality of the sexes, or are women disadvantaged in such relationships? Is there a need for Muslims to rethink some of the patriarchal elements that survive in their marriages? Let's sit down and get right into this controversial yet important discussion with Dr. Shabir Ally. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So when we started our series on controversial issues related to women, we talked about, that Islam looks at women in a positive light. We talked about the need for ijtihad, like critical thinking. Do you think that's needed in the area of marriage?
Yes, definitely. When we spoke about the positive features, we saw that Islam actually, at the time of the Quranic revelation, made great advances in the rights of women and the way in which women were viewed. But of course, the rest of the world continued to advance beyond that. And what has happened with Islamic law is that Islamic law tended to freeze with that moment in time of the first revelation, as if the whole world is going to stand still. And everything that was said in the Quran is going to apply exactly the way it was applied and understood at the time. And because the rest of the world continued to progress and develop, and we did not allow the child of Islam to grow, Islam as a child to grow and develop and be on par with the rest of the world, this is why we're finding a great dichotomy between the way in which Muslims perceive Islam today, generally with classical roots, and the way in which the world runs. And the solution for this dichotomy is for Muslim scholars to apply the principle of ijtihad, of sound reasoning, going back to our sources, but showing how they might apply to a modern context. If Muslim scholars were to do that, then obviously we would not have this kind of dichotomy. We would be living Islam with the original principles, but applied in a new and different context.
So within that framing of the conversation, do you think that men and women are equal in a marriage from an Islamic perspective?
In the classical view, no. And we have to be clear about this because Muslims will imagine that what we are thinking today must be Islam, and that must have always been what Islam was thought to be. But the classical Muslim scholars did not think that women had an equal status in the marriage. They thought that the woman was actually somewhat inferior, and the man had a lot of rights over the women.
So are you bringing that perspective? Are you saying that it wasn't equal because of what Quran said about women at the time, or because of the interpretation, or like where's that perspective coming from?
It's actually both, because some of what the Quran says obviously reflects the conditions and circumstances at the time. The past societies were largely patriarchal. Women had few rights, if any. And the Quran, in dealing with that society and situation and giving laws on how to improve the situation, could not overturn everything overnight, even though God is revealing the Quran. But if God wants to work within the natural processes, then even here, God will have to go slowly here, because if you're dealing with an egg, you have to treat it gently lest you crack or break it. So in giving laws, God had to apply wisdom in giving the laws that could actually make some practical difference at the time. And the classical case of this is the issue of slavery, which is not unrelated to the condition of women, but thinking about slavery, why wasn't slavery abolished in the Quran from day one in a simple declaration from God? The answer from Muslim scholars is that would not have been practical. You have to change the entire economic system to make it possible for slaves, once released, to have a reasonable income. So certain circumstances have to be accepted as they are, and you can only deal with them by gradual incremental change, not by a total revolution all at once. And indeed, we can see that in the rest of the world, slavery took a while to be abolished, several centuries after the initial revelation of the Islamic message in the form of the Quran. and what has happened in Muslim societies is that Muslim scholars tended to resist the abolition of slavery because they thought that this is un-Quranic, because the Quran didn't actually say so. Now we have a parallel feature happening with, or phenomenon happening with the rights of women. The rights of women has advanced as the human rights in general that led to the abolishment of slavery. And Muslim scholars have tended to resist the advancement of women's rights because, again, they're thinking this is not Quranic, the Quran didn't actually say so. And to add to this, the modern Western societies have gone further in not only advancing the individual rights, but throwing away what they would regard as the yoke of divine revelation and law. And so they promote a kind of liberal way of life that includes sexual promiscuity. To them, it's no longer something shameful or sinful or even objectionable in some cases. So Muslim scholars looking at that, and not only Muslim scholars, but Muslims generally may be thinking, look, we can't go the way of the modern Western society because altogether with the advancement of women's rights, look what they have done to society. The woman has become not only liberated, but she's actually, in a reverse way, at least for some women, they have become enslaved. To the passions of men and to the desires of modern Western society. Women have become used and abused, especially in the pornographic industry and in prostitution and so on. So
you're talking about that from the perspective of commodification of women and based on society and what's happening with that.
Yes, and looking at this, Muslim scholars and sometimes Muslims more generally recoil from the advances that modern Western civilization has achieved in terms of women's rights, and they want to hold on to the original pristine pure Islam as they understand it to have come from the 7th century of Arabia, so they don't want any change in this regard. So there is a great need for us to not see a dichotomy between these two things, but again to see a third way, the third way being that we together with the modern world are all thinkers. We share a very common thinking base. There are so many advances in human thought that feed into all of our minds, whether we like it or not. And while our religion teaches us to take what is wholesome and good and to refuse what is foul and evil, we need to draw that distinction. Yes, we will resist what is foul and evil, but the advances in women's rights by themselves is not un-Islamic. In fact, it is very Islamic, and this is the very thing that Islam was doing. It is the very thing that the Quran was doing in the 7th century, advancing women's rights, but to the point that it could make a difference in the society at the time, rather than being merely theoretical. That would be entirely rejected at the time because it will seem so fantastic and incredible at the time.
So just to bring it back now to the idea of marriage, in what ways, for someone who might be thinking, well, Dr. Shabir, I don't know what you're talking about, in what ways are Muslim women disadvantaged in the current marriage system from an Islamic lens?
Well, there are several things, and we'll talk in more detail in other episodes about polygyny, which is an issue, and divorce, which is actually related to marriage. But looking at other issues, one of the issues is that there is no minimum age prescribed for an allowable Islamic marriage. So a boy or girl could get married very early. For a boy, this may not prove to be much of a problem because he always has the option of divorce. The woman did not have the option of divorce. She could seek a dissolution of her marriage, but that's a long process and it requires taking her case to the Muslim court, or in a modern context where Muslims are minorities, maybe taking it to a council of imams or something like this. But for the boy, he can just simply utter the word divorce and he's freed from a marriage that he does not like. So the woman can be quite disadvantaged in this situation. Now, we speak often about the consent of a woman in marriage, but that consent does not apply to minor girls. A girl could be married off by her father, or her grandfather without her consent.
So this is an Islamic principle.
It is well known, and it is classified and codified in Islamic textbooks dealing with Islamic law.
From dating back previously, right? That this was
This
the
is very
case?
early,
Okay.
yes. And some will find even a Quranic indication of this. And in fact, it is not only in Muslim societies that girls got married early, but also in other societies as well in ancient times. Because nowadays we know about the pressures of modern life, not only girls, but boys as well. They have universities to attend. And typically, by the time they're 25, they're done with university. Around that age, they start looking to get married. But in ancient times, people did not have all of these modern pressures, and their great contribution to societies would have been to get married, have children. They increased the number of the tribe. The tribe became larger and stronger. So each individual was contributing something to the growth of the tribe. And women in particular, that would have been a great contribution to their tribes by getting married early and having children. Also, people were mindful of their daughters in case their daughters might become pregnant outside of marriage. So a safe way, especially in honor and shame societies, was for them to get their girls married early, and that meant that whatever happened now with their daughters happened within a marriage, whether for good or bad, but it at least alleviated that aspect of shame from the family of a girl.
I think obviously there are a lot of issues, and I think I'm going to unilaterally decide that we need a second episode for this. But just as we wrap up, do you still think, in light of these brief issues that we talked about, and acknowledging that we'll probably need to have another episode where we talk more about the issues, that Islam still views women in a positive light, as we framed our initial discussion?
Well, yes, but here by Islam I mean my conception of what Islam is. Involving the Quran as the basic teaching of Islam, understood against the backdrop of its historical circumstances and now reapplied to a modern and changing situation. So yes, this sees women in a positive light and will embrace many of the rights and responsibilities that are recognized for women in a modern context, so that the Muslim does not find himself or herself in this kind of cognitive dissonance between seeing what is right and thinking that Islam does not allow that. But if we're thinking that the classical view that Muslim scholars had about women, that this is equivalent to our modern concepts, no, that's wrong. The classical Muslim scholars did not see it this way, and they did not think that women have equal rights.
A wonderful, dramatic end to an interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.